Good evening again. I'd like to call the committee the committee of the whole for the Village of Cary for Tuesday, November 17th, 2020, to order with roll call, please.
Kraus?
Here.
Collier?
Here.
Betts?
Here.
Weinheimer? Here. McAlpine?
Here.
Cavelli?
Here.
Thank you. Would you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Now moving to the public comments. There is nobody here, so we have no public comments. We'll end that at 6:17. Now to the business at hand, a discussion regarding police pension fund and our actuarial projection. Michael.
First item this evening is the annual actuarial report, which is prepared by Foster & Foster. The report's as of May 1, 2020, and the contributions that are outlined in here apply to the fiscal year that ends April 30th, 2022. Our contribution this year, of course, continues to go up. It went up from $1,069,489 in the current year to $1,185,306 for next year. It is a substantial increase. There are some changes that occurred, which Heidi Andorfer, who is the actuary from Foster & Foster, who is with us this evening to kind of walk us through some of these items. Again, I'd like to just make the board aware that these increases that we tend to deal with on an annual basis, I don't envision ending anytime soon. I mean, they will continue to come in, but we are required to fund either at the rate of the independent actuaries report to make sure that we are fully funded, 100% funded, and that's what we're geared for by 2040, or we have the option of funding from the numbers we get from the Illinois Department of Insurance. We have chosen, as most people do, to go with an independent actuary. And at this point in time, I'll turn it over to Heidi, and she can kind of walk us through some of the changes that occurred in the report this year. Heidi?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate that. I'm going to attempt to screen share it. I have it won't let me screen share. Okay. I can walk you through some of the numbers here to go over the highlights of the report effectively. So as Michael mentioned, the contribution did go up year over year. We expect that to go up annually. There's several factors that are involved in that, and I'll get into some of that detail tonight. But let's start with the liabilities first. So when we looked at this year's valuation, the liability was $25.6 million. That went up from 23.6 last year. And the reason for that increase was largely driven by a loss to the fund. In addition, we do expect liability to grow each year as the actives continue to accrue service in the fund. So the liability in the fund is measured based on service that's earned to date. So to the extent that your actives earn additional service, the liability for those folks does increase every year. When we look at the actual value of assets, we did see an increase year over year. Went from 13 million to 13.9 million, partially due to the contributions that the village funded, and we did fully fund the recommended amount, which is good. I like to look at that number for the health of the fund, and when I see that the village is actually trying to meet those numbers, that's always a good sign that the fund is in good shape. But in addition, that market that actual value of assets is actually a smooth value from market value. So if I was to look at your actual returns year over year, you only returned 1% from May 1st of 2019 to April 30th of 2020. You had a terrible measurement date. April 30th wasn't good for any fund. The fact that you were north of 0%, you should feel good about when you have 1%. We've seen funds that had much worse returns. So the problem with that though is that you do have a loss for this year, and that does get smoothed. If we were to measure this on a market value basis, things would look much worse because we would be reflecting all of that loss at once. But because we do use an actuarial value of assets, we smooth those losses over a 5-year time frame so that you won't have that volatility introduced into the contribution calculation. So it stabilizes the calculation a bit. We do expect it to increase. That's the nature of the methodology that's being employed, but it isn't as dramatic as it would be if we were to eat that whole loss at once in one given year. Now, the opposite relationship happened last year. You had a higher return, and your smoothing resulted in something closer to market value.
Heidi, I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you able to try the screen share? We unlocked it. If you could try that again, just so we could
Absolutely, yeah.
maybe see what you're talking about better.
Sure.
Is that sharing?
Okay, are you able to see that slide from Foster? And
Yes.
Foster?
Yes.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
Okay, so let me,
Thank you, Heidi.
okay, no problem. This is actually helpful to everybody here.
Yep.
Okay, so if you see the numbers I was talking about here, so we're at the second row here, the actual value of assets, you can see that increase there, and that's the number I was referring to as smooth over this 5-year time frame. When we look at that, now we have the unfunded actual accrued liability. What this number represents is the service that's already been earned in the fund, but still needs to be paid for. So the village has an obligation to basically pay the mortgage down on this unfunded actual accrued liability. You can see that unfunded did increase year over year. So we aren't seeing that number come down. The primary reason for that, well, there's two drivers. One, we did have a year over year loss, and I'll get into some of the details of loss in the next slide. But the other issue with this is the methodology that's being employed at this point in time actually has a payment on this unfunded actual accrued liability that is only covering part of the interest. So this number is projected to grow with interest annually, and if you're not covering that interest payment, similar to a mortgage on a house, you'll actually see an increase. Now, a mortgage on a house always touches principal. There's not a methodology that's allowed that would allow you to not pay down some of the principal, but in the pension world, there is a methodology that's allowed, and it has to be payroll growth assumption, and I'll talk about that in another couple slides as well. That gives you a decrease in the funded percentage year over year. So we went from 55.1 down to 54.1. We saw a lot of funds with a 4/30 measurement date or May 1st valuation date decrease year over year. Hopefully that rebounds next year and we see the opposite relationship, but it was just a bad timing for when to measure. The contribution requirement, as Michael mentioned, did go up from about 1.1 million to 1.2 million year over year. This contribution will apply to the fiscal year ending 4/30/2022. So we're looking to levy this for that future fiscal year end date.
And just for the village board's benefit, that is our contribution. That is coming from the village of Cary. That is a real number there of almost $1.2 million.
Okay, so if we look at the head counts here at the bottom, you can see that things didn't look like they changed that much, but there's actually quite a bit of movement in some of these numbers. So you can see the active head count was stable at 25, but the way we got there was we had 25 folks on May 1st, 2019, 3 people retired, 1 person terminated, and then 4 were rehired to replace them. So you got back to the 25, but those retirements, the fact that you had 3 retirements in a population of 25 folks did cause a loss. Generally, in any years where we have a significant number of retirements, you'll see a loss to the fund. And then there will be some years where you have no retirements, the fund will actually experience gains in those years. So over time, it does smooth out, but this is a year that you did hit a loss with those retirements and the timing of that. Those 3 retirements are reflected in that second row, and that termination is reflected in that bottom row. So that's how we got to these numbers. So I'm going to flip you to the second slide here. And this is a reconciliation of how the contribution changed year over year. So line 1 is showing you last year's contribution. Line 3 is showing you where we're expecting this year's to be. And the section 2 here will show you what contributed to that. And there were multiple factors that did contribute to that increase. First of all, we did see those active decrements here. Those active decrements were about $23,000 of the increase. That was those 3 retirements. The fact that you had 3 retirements was more than we would have expected. We would have expected closer to 1, and you ended up with 3. The next one that was a big increase was this benefits change. So in December of 2019, there was legislation passed that says that the tier 2 folks have an increased benefit. Basically, the biggest driver of that being that their final average salary used to be an 8-year average, it's now a 4-year average. So higher pay is being averaged into the benefit calculation, higher benefits, higher liability, and that's going to increase everything all around. So your new normal is about $25,000 higher than where it would have been just because of those benefits that were granted to the tier 2. This was legislated at the state level. Nothing the village could have done about this, but it does increase the contribution by about $25,000. We saw an offset to that, though, the change in employer normal costs. So the fact that while you ended up with a stable head count of 25 year over year, you did lose some of your, quote, more expensive folks. So the closer folks get to retirement, they generally have higher pay and they have a higher annual accrual. When you replace those with 4 new people that were tier 2, so they're going to be cheaper than tier 1, even with the benefit changes, those folks actually bring less into the fund than what was being brought in the prior year in terms of accruals. And so you saw a decrease year over year for the fact that you did have those retirements in this line item. And then the last one I want to point out is this payroll growth amortization payment increase of about $28,000. This one is the one that, due to the methodology that's employed in your fund to amortize that unfunded, every year, all else being equal, I'm going to come back to you with the number about $28,000, $30,000 higher than the prior year. So you can assume that this number will be about $30,000 higher next year if all of the assumptions are met. And that's due to the payroll growth methodology. So effectively, you have a lower contribution to that unfunded today at the expense of it becoming higher and higher and higher each year. So unlike the mortgage on a house that will be a stable number annually, every year the unfunded, all else being equal, will increase, and in your case it's by 4% a year. So the assumption on payroll growth is 4%, and the idea is that you're trying to keep your unfunded payment level with the expected payroll of the police force. And so we're basically assuming that the police force will have a 4% growth in payroll each year, and therefore the unfunded will tie that number. Now we know that that's not the case. The historic numbers have been much lower for that, but that is what's happening right now. This is a tough assumption to change. So if I look at the next slide, we have a summary of the assumptions that are used in the fund. 7% is probably on the high end with respect to where assumptions are of a fund your size. In one sense, I'd like to see that come down. That being said, the fund will go through consolidation in the next year or two, where assets are all going to be managed at the state level on a consolidated basis. And with that comes more investment opportunity. They're opening up the options to invest differently and more aggressively than what the funds have been able to do at this point in time. So in light of that, I think we might be in a wait and see position with respect to the interest rate to see where that will play out once the fund is consolidated. All the funds will be invested the same way, and therefore, to the extent that they are taking advantage of some of the more aggressive investments that can be had, we should see this 7% be supported. We did change the mortality assumption last year, so this Pub-S table is a public sector table. It is the latest and greatest. It is the only table of its kind that focused on public sector mortality experience, and it is specific to safety officers, so it is very accurate for the population. We feel good about where we are there. The one assumption I think we need to keep on the radar, though, is this payroll growth assumption, because it will have an annual increase in that unfunded amortization payment of 4% per year. We'd like to see that come down. The result of bringing this assumption down would be higher contributions in the short term, but you won't see this steep rise in the contribution longer term. So at this point in time, with a 4% payroll growth assumption, at the end of the amortization period, you may be paying 2 to 3 times what you're paying now on the unfunded, as opposed to having a approach where this is more stable annually. It's a hard assumption to change, though, because it does mean shorter term higher contributions. So that's an assumption we'd like to see that come down. To put that in perspective, your real payroll growth average over the last 5 years has been 1.6%. So we're clearly disconnected from where reality is. We understand the last 5-year period has been a bit of an anomaly, very low inflation environment. So the 1.6 might not be the best long-term place to land, but 4% seems a bit aggressive. So I'd like to see that assumption come down, which will result in shorter term higher contributions as well. So with that, I didn't have any other additional things to discuss here. I think we hit the highlights, but I'd love to field any questions from the board.
Any board members have any questions for Heidi?
It's a very complicated process.
It is, yes. And I think it's just going to get more complicated as we move forward.
But the main thing is that we're on goal to meet to fully fund it by 2040.
Right.
So that's what I want to make sure we stay on the trajectory for that.
Thanks. So remember that almost $1.2 million is a hard number for us to look at this next year. So
Correct. And as you heard Heidi say, I mean, we've got on this slide right here, we've got some work to do at interest rate at 7%, which is a little bit higher than where she's recommending, and also our payroll growth assumption. So turning those down, as the board has done over the last couple of years, our interest rate, we've moved that down, and this year we're moving the payroll growth assumption down. Obviously, as Heidi said, that requires us to kick in more funds. So we just got to continue to work at it here, but these are big numbers. This is being funded here through our general fund, essentially. Right. So it's not going to get smaller. It's just going to continue to increase, and we've got to work on it collectively. But I appreciate, Heidi, your overview. It was a great job of explaining this. It's very complicated, but appreciate the slides that you had here and the information to share with the board.
thank you, Heidi.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Heidi.
Next on the agenda is a discussion regarding the 6-month budget review. Michael.
Next item. This year, when we adopted the budget in the spring, COVID hit. And as a group, I came before you and said, based on everything that we're hearing, we expect that we could lose close to $1 million this year, just in the fact of some of our revenue sources may not perform as well as we expected. And that was due to businesses being shut down and the like. Working with staff, working with all of the department directors who do this on an annual basis, as much as possible, the first thing we attempt to do is try and hold down the expenses that we were planning on. And we look to, as openings come in the form of personnel, people leaving, the like, all of those positions tend to get evaluated to decide if we're going to move forward with rehiring that position or not. Overall, as we looked 6 months into the budget year, what we were seeing was actually we performed better than we anticipated. And we told the board that we would come back and talk to you about that. At this point in time, based on what we're seeing today, and with the cures money that we received from DCEO, upwards of $700,000, actually at this time, I'm projecting that we could end with that money seeing a surplus this year of upwards of $500,000. As wonderful as it sounds, there are a lot of downside to that. First and foremost, I tell you, my big concern right now is everything we worried about in March, are we going to be worrying about those same things come December, January, February? Who knows? It's great to know that there's a vaccine coming. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to get to us in the short term. So we're going to have to continue to live with some of the ongoing things. We have seen some positive revenue numbers or variances in revenue numbers we expected to receive, and I've outlined those on the table. There are some items where where revenue items have not performed as well as we expected, and we know why. I mean, a lot of those are due to sales tax. Whether it's businesses that shut down, weren't able to operate as they normally would, that's probably one factor. At this point in time in the budget that we approved, we had anticipated that Thornton's would be here. And based on Thornton's being here, we had projected or added money to our budget in the form of sales tax to reflect that. With them not coming, of course, that puts us in a negative position right to begin with, but they're still coming. It's just a matter of time in terms of when it gets here. And then there were just a couple of expense items that, just based on things that occurred during the year, where expenses are actually coming in a little bit higher than we anticipated. I will tell you, and I've stood up here and told you before, as much as possible, the easiest part for us is to try and control our expenses. I mean, we have some control over that. We can deal with that, and we do deal with it month over month, year after year, trying to contain our expenses as much as possible. The numbers that cause us problems are those revenue numbers. You know, if things come along, things out of our control that we can't, then number one, it's my job to bring those negative variances in front of the board so you're at least aware of them. That doesn't necessarily fix them, but I guess being on that side of the glass, you can never come back to me and say, but you didn't let us know that, because as much as possible, we try and let you know. A couple of things. Number one, even though we're showing a surplus for this year, I would tell you right now, our biggest struggle will be putting next year's budget together. Yeah. And where we take into account what's happening within the economy, seeing how those revenue sources are tracking, seeing if those negative variances are still being there. And there are expenses that continue to go up. I mean, before you know it, just as Heidi mentioned to you, we're looking at $120,000 in the pension alone that adds to this. You take that number, you take our annual wage and benefit increases, just based on the contracts we've approved. And you start adding up those numbers and you get to the point where you could be easily $400,000 higher than you were in operating expenses the previous year, and sometimes there's not necessarily $400,000 of revenue to offset that. With COVID too, we're also dealing with the fact of when people aren't traveling downtown, cars aren't parking in our commuter lot. When the commuter lot's not full, there's revenue that's not being generated in the parking fund, yet there are expenses that will continue to fall there. Based on all of the improvements we've made within the commuter lot, with the new depot that's out there, the other improvements that are getting finished, there may be a cash flow issue with the parking fund, of which we may have to contribute money on a temporary interfund loan basis from the general fund to the parking fund just to make positive cash flow there. We have the means to do it. I'm not saying we don't have the means to do it, but it's also important to understand that when is it that the parking fund will be able to repay that interfund loan? How long will it be before all of those commuter vehicles will be back there? Based on COVID and the impact it's had on the economy, will we regain the number of cars that used to park in our lot? Many things can change over time. I just want you to be aware of that, because that's just another ball we have to juggle there. It's nice to say on one hand that we're looking at this pot of money. I'm telling you, in a very short period of time, that little bucket of money that we have can disappear very quickly. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. We've tried as much as possible to tell you where we believe things we'll end the fiscal year, and now we're just waiting to see how the economy is going to be impacted with the latest COVID experience.
I think it's important to note too, and that was a good overview, Mike, but the revenues that we projected here, the potential budget variances, the slide that we had put together, this was put together before we learned that gaming machines would be shut down.
Sure.
The tier 3 mitigations would be going into effect this Friday. So this is based on the information that we have at the time that we put this together. Things are going to change. I mean, this $569,000 anticipated surplus that we would have is just based on the best information that we have at this time. There's so much that is out of our control right now. If it wasn't for that CARES reimbursement, we'd be looking at a potential deficit here of $200,000. As you know, we talked about, Mike had mentioned, and we talked during the budget process, you know, going back in March and April, we were anticipating that number could be $1 million. So I appreciate the work. You know, our department directors, our staff, they take this seriously. They understand that, you know, we need to tighten things up, and we've tightened things up. We've also seen some of these revenues, excuse me, come in a little bit better than what we expected. So I guess my messaging is for this fiscal year, there's a lot of uncertainty. There has been. It will continue to be uncertain here going forward. But we're going to try to get this information in front of you through the monthly reports, through conversations, and just continue to work the problem. Next fiscal year is going to be a challenge, as Mike said. It is going to be a challenge for us to put that budget together. The police pension contribution every year, as Mike mentioned, contractual wages that we have, it's not unique. This isn't unique to Cary. Every community is facing those challenges. And insurance, I mean, those are the three big ones, the health insurance contribution. You add all those up, you're already at, you know, a couple $100,000 increase. And if we're not seeing revenues go up, that's a tough nut to crack. And so we just have to continue to talk openly about this and, you know, work through these issues. So we'd be more than happy to answer any questions that the board has.
The sales tax number, that's what we're down, 172,000 from budget estimate.
That's what we're projecting for through the end of the
To
year,
finish.
based on the experience that we've seen through the first 6 months.
Okay.
And like I said, of that number that's sitting there, the 172,
Right.
there's probably $60,000 of that is probably attributed to the gas station alone.
Right.
Just in additional revenue that
What
we
we saw.
figured might flow through.
That's to finish in the red. We're anticipating to finish in the red by that number.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
yes.
And that could change here
Could be
too.
worse.
Yeah.
Could be much worse.
I mean, we are fortunate. I mean, you know, on one hand, we sit here and we would say, hey, we'd love to have all these large sales tax generating things. There's a good side to that and bad side.
Right.
Communities that have a lot of car sales, when car sales go down, the impact is huge and it's immediate. A lot of the sales tax that we're seeing here in the village of Cary is day-to-day items that people are buying. People are going to go to the grocery store, whether there's COVID-19 or not, maybe more than they have in the past. Restaurants will get hurt from that. But our large sales taxpayer, those gas stations that are out there, the food stores that are out there, those will continue to contribute. I don't see a bulk of that money going away. It's hard to grow that number based on the fact of what's happening to our restaurants and other small businesses in town.
We pumped the brakes too on a few positions. You know, not getting into all the details of them, but as the board knows, we've tried to be creative here and, you know, hiring a temp agency to fill one of the positions. A couple others we've just held vacant here for now too. I just want to get through, you know, these next, I don't know how many months it's going to end up being, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and see where we're at. So we're trying to be conservative, but again, at the same token, we're a service-oriented business, we need staff to provide that service to our residents and our customers.
Right, and as everybody knows, we are a lean and mean operation, and I have full confidence in our staff as well as the board that will make the decisions needed to continue providing the services that our residents and businesses have grown accustomed to. We're not alone in this. In all the conversations I've had with other mayors and their staff as well, these are very common situations. Like Michael had mentioned, there's a lot of municipalities that have an enormous amount of retail, and they are suffering substantially because of the loss of their retail sales tax. So, we're not alone, but we're fortunate enough that we are a lean operation, that we can make these necessary changes and course adjustments as we go forward. Is there anybody else out there in
I do.
Zoom land that's got a comment?
I have something to say. Okay.
Trustee
I'm just
Kalfan?
saying that I appreciate this because I think this is a great tool for all of us to be kept informed with what's going on. And I appreciate that we are very, as everyone has mentioned here, Jake and the mayor, that we are a very lean operation. And I think it is, I'm going to just put that plug in a little bit again about let's get everyone to do as much as we can to shop local, support our local businesses to any extent that we can. I mean, if someone enjoys going to shop for groceries in Crystal Lake, hey, reel it back, get into Cary. I mean, just keep the tax revenues here as much, let's do as much as we can that we do have control over.
I have a quick question about the motor fuel tax fund.
Yes.
Where does that $400,000 come from, Rebuild Illinois allocation? Why is that so much higher?
They provided us some funding
Right.
that's based on a per capita formula coming out of the state that goes into the motor fuel tax fund. It has to be treated in the same manner, which was put out there for capital projects.
Okay.
I think Eric and Jake have brought projects to you in terms of what you planned on spending those funds for, but at the point in time when the budget was adopted, we did not plug those numbers into the MFT fund, and that's why we're showing them here, so you realize they're there.
We didn't have that entered as a revenue at all.
Right.
That
It was
was,
an unknown.
That money wasn't
Yeah.
available to
Yeah.
us at that
that
point.
didn't
came
have it, right.
out, the state announced that, as Mike said, on a per capita basis, so we were getting $1.2 million over the next few years. These are the allotments that we've received so far. So that money right now we're planning on that to be used for downtown, as we've talked about with the village board
Right.
previously.
Okay.
But that's why that's showing as an increase there, because it wasn't accounted for.
And that's spread over 3 years.
I forget if it's 2 or 3 years,
2 years.
Mike, 2
2
years?
to 3 years, I
Yeah.
think it was. I think it was like 2.5 years, Jake.
Yeah, $200,000 a crack. So we've already received 2 payments.
2 payments of it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, good question.
Any other questions here? Anybody on Zoom have a question? Trustees Cavelli, Kraus, Weinhammer?
No, I don't.
Thank you,
No.
thank you,
No.
thank you. Okay, Michael, let's move on to,
Michael, you're the star of the show.
I told you he's going to pay it.
Thank God it's all in one evening.
We're emptying the tank tonight,
Yeah.
right?
We won't see him again.
Okay, tax levy, please.
Tax levy. I mean, we have had this similar discussion for probably the last 5 years, or I know I've stood up here for 5 years. And what I'll do is try and summarize it as best as possible, okay? We have pretty much the last couple of years left that levy fairly constant. The only change to our tax levy, which is assessed to our residents, is when we've made the decision to add new growth that comes on the tax rolls. Our current tax levy, right as we speak, last year it was $2,532,210. Based on the formula out there for a non-home rule community subject to tax caps, the county is telling us from the reports that we have that we could raise that up to from 2,532 to 2,598,000. And the two pieces that can be associated with that change that we can consider are related to new growth and CPI, which is inflation. The inflation factor amounts to about $58,241. And in past years, when we've had that discussion, as much as I've tried to sway you at times to accept that CPI growth in our tax levy, generally what we've resorted to is just approving the new growth, or at least the last couple of years. Prior to that, we weren't even too keen about accepting the new growth. And hopefully we've had that discussion enough. New growth, again, is something that is not going to impact your existing residential and business taxpayers. Any new growth that we're picking up or we're increasing the tax levy is going to be paid by those new taxpayers coming on the tax rolls. So there is no negative impact on our residents by accepting the new growth. Again, it's only $8,000. $8,000 may not seem like a lot. I'll take anything I can get. But that's $8,000 a year going forward into perpetuity. So it may only be $8,000, but over 10 years, it's $80,000. And if you don't take it, it's gone. You don't have the opportunity to say, let's go back a year and pick up the new growth, because the tax system does not allow us to do that. One thing I wanted to point out to you, though, just so that we can put it in perspective. The village of Cary taxes its residents and businesses to the tune of $2,532,000 annually, spread out over all the taxpayers. Well, you saw from our previous discussion, 1.2 of that $2.5 million goes directly towards police pension. I believe when I came here 5 years ago, that pension number was around $500,000. And it's gone up over that period of time from there to the 1.2. We will reach the point in time in the not too distant future that pretty much this levy that you're levying will go almost completely towards police pension, which means we then have to fund everything else from other revenue sources that are sitting out there in the general fund. And those are things that I always like to make you aware of, because it does put it in perspective. I mean, we have continued to manage the dollars coming into the village of Cary in the best manner I think we can possibly. But those expenses go up on an annual basis, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of new revenue sources to make up for them. So what we're asking you to consider this year, first off, we are recommending that our levy go up by the amount of the new growth to $2,540,400. If the board is willing to accept that, in December, we will bring the tax levy ordinance back to you and have you approve it based on that amount of that recommendation. As I've said in the past, I'd like it to be higher. I understand your concern for the taxpayers in the community. We've had that discussion, like I said, numerous times. So I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have at this point in time.
Anybody here at the Village Hall have any questions?
I have a question. It's going to sound maybe dumb.
Not at all.
No.
In basic terms, and you don't have to do it right now, but you present to us, what would happen on a percentage basis to individual homeowners' taxes if we took in both the CPI and new growth?
It's something that could be
Calculated, correct?
calculated. All we
On
do
an
is,
average, so people can hear a real number in their own head from what they pay now.
and how that's done, just so you're aware of it, is taxes are based on the village's total EAV. And in this backup information, this page right here, it shows you excuse me for my mask dropping here.
You're
It-
fine.
it
You're behind
shows you
the,
a total EAV number for the Village of Cary. Okay? If I were to take, I know what our existing tax rate is for the Village of Cary. Okay, and there's a couple points I want to make about that. But EAV is based on, or taxes are based on per $100 of EAV. So if I take the EAV number, divide it by 100, and multiply it by our tax rate, if I did that, that would give me the 2532 number we have now. To answer Dale's question, there would be a slight increase. It would not be significant on any residential taxpayer, and I'd have to compute it to try and tell you that. I could show you what impact it would have on the village's tax rate. I mean, even by leaving our levy the same, because our EAV goes up annually, I mean, this year, our EAV went from 520 million last year to 541 million. So the amount that our levy is being spread is spread against a bigger pot of dollars to begin with. And we would expect that number to continue to go up in the future. So you could reach a point in time, and I'm not saying it would work out exactly, but you could consider the CPI and accept that new growth, and it may not have little or would have little or no change on the Village of Cary's tax rate. The problem is when you look at that, unfortunately, when people get their tax bills, there are 10 other taxing bodies out there. And most of them have been extremely realistic. And in many cases, some of those levies from the other taxing bodies have come down. But there are increases that do come in the tax levies. Generally because 65, 70% of your tax bill is coming from school districts, those levies tend to go up. Those school districts would love to have new tax dollars to generate more tax dollars for our schools. So as much as we try and minimize the residents' impact based on our levy, people, when they see their tax bills, kind of scratch their head and say, what happened? I thought the Village of Cary was keeping their taxes the same. Well, we did, but unfortunately somebody else might have increased theirs. And the first place generally people are going to look is that somehow the Village of Cary is doing this. And I understand that. That is not something new. That has happened for years and years and years. That's just some people's perception of the system. But just imagine over the population of the Village of Cary, if you were talking $68,000, you can see that the impact is not going to be substantial. But in these times, I do understand and I can relate to people who say, under COVID-19, I'm struggling to pay my water bill. And I know as a board that you have always been cognizant of those concerns. And so that is why we present you the material. And based on the question you asked, we can attempt to get that information for you. It's hard, Dale, when you ask based on an average resident, what's an average resident's tax bill? You know what I mean? I could pick some of the lower ones, pick some of the higher ones. I guess it depends on which tax bill you're paying. So generally, when we have these discussions, we don't try and define it based on this household or that household for that simple reason. But it is a number that can be calculated.
Thank you.
Yes?
You know, I appreciate and exactly where we're at with everything. I think that anyone you ask is going to say, what do they, if they're going to come up with one thing they dislike about Cary, it's going to be our taxes. And I think that, as Michael, as you eloquently put, everyone does think it rolls down to us. Everyone assumes it. So it's an educational piece that people just assume. I can tell people forward, backwards, and upside down that, hey, we're only 5% of the bill, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I can look at my own bill and go, wow, boy, I know in X amount of years we've not taken any increase. Why does my bill keep going up? Well, because our other taxing bodies are identifying that they have increased expenses and that they need to make sure that they meet the needs to keep up with those expenses so they don't fall behind. So I'm caught in a quandary as well. I would like to, what Dale had mentioned, I would love to have a rough idea of what some of those approximations, and of course it's an approximation. If someone's got a $5,000 bill and someone has a $15,000 bill, it's obviously going to be very different. But I think to make a well-informed, educated decision, the more information we can have, the best decision we can make. I think that without question, for me, new growth, I think that that's our responsibility to take that because it does not impact directly on our residents currently. It's just saying, hey, some new businesses or some new development came to town and we want to be able to take advantage of the financial benefits that come along with that. So I think that it's in our best interest to do that from a responsibility standpoint. And I'm not saying that I'm for, I'm not saying I'm for going with consumer price index or CPI and new growth. I just would love to, if it's something that we can get out to the board, I would love to at least have that information so that we could make a well-informed decision.
I think one of the things that I could do is I could probably, just based on your tax bills alone, if you forwarded me your
I'd be happy
tax
to.
bill, I could tell you, related to your own tax bill,
Sure.
the impact that that would have on that. I think what's important for us to know is that for the meeting in December where we prepare the tax levy, what we need to do is start preparing so that we have a tax levy ordinance that we can put before you, that we can have you approve. I guess there's nothing wrong with having one that takes into account the new growth and one that takes into account the CPI and new growth. And at that point in time, a decision could be made in which one that you would choose to approve.
Right.
We've just got to decide at that second meeting in December so that the levy can be filed.
Yeah,
Yes.
this has got to be done by the end of December.
Yes.
Yes.
Correct.
Any questions from trustees Cavelli, Kraus, or Weinhammer? Hello?
No, I'm good. I would be in favor of the new growth.
Thank you. Trustee Weinhammer, are you leaning any particular way?
I don't have any questions at this time. I do see that I was in favor of new growth in the past. I'm not 100% how I feel about it right now with so many businesses hurting and things like that. So I'm not for sure on that yet.
Okay, we'll get more information. Trustee Cavelli?
I'll be in favor of no increase on the tax levy whatsoever. I do agree with what Trustee Weinhammer mentioned. And then also, I guess clarify a question for Michael. So when you said there's no impact on existing residents, what about new residents coming into Cary? The new growth of some of the new homes?
No, I mean, the new growth for anybody, any new taxpayer that comes, I guess, any new home that was added, of course, they're going to have a tax bill just like any other resident. So I think it would be an impact, Trustee Cavelli, that they would expect to see. But my point is, from that new home being added, that new home being added is not in somehow negatively impacting your tax bill as a resident of the village of Cary. They're just paying their fair share just like everybody else is.
I agree, but with everything going on now, people hurting and people out of work, and if they are trying to downsize or bad year to do that. We were just talking about, we had some surplus. I know we discussed that we may not have that, but I just think this would be a year to keep the tax levy at 0.
But just to be clear for the board though, by taking the new growth, there's no negative impact to our existing taxpayers.
None.
Okay, well, we'll get the other information that
Right.
trustee Collier and McAlpine have asked for, and we'll get it to everybody so they can make a decision that they're comfortable making.
So it sounds like we've kind of got three different
Yes.
thoughts on it. So I guess what we'll try to do, if people have questions, certainly give me a call and we can coordinate calls. If we need to have finance director DeSharm on a call. We'll probably plan for further discussion on those three options then.
Put this
Yep.
back in the committee, the next meeting?
Or Scott, can we present it 3 different ways and then pick A, B, C? I mean,
Yeah, I think my plan is just on that second meeting in December, I'd just bring this back and we decide which way we go.
Okay, so that gives the trustees plenty of time to get together with myself or staff to go over what their concerns are. And by that time, we will have a report from Michael that will answer some of our questions and help us guide
sure.
our decision-making process. Okay, any other comments or questions for Michael at this time?
It's great to see you, Michael.
It is nice to see you. Thank you for
Please,
coming in for this.
I appreciate all the questions, so please, if ever, even if it's not a meeting, if somebody has a question, if you email me, I'll gladly provide you whatever I can provide you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the feedback, board members. Thank you.
And I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please, Courtney.
Collier,
Yes.
Cavelli,
Yes.
Kraus,
Yes.
Weinheimer? Yes. McAlpine?
Yes?
Benz?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Be in touch. Stay safe.
Everyone have a great Thanksgiving.
Do you have some